Hello, everyone. Let's do a review for exam 1. You will find this document listed under study materials. So let's take a look at chapter 1, which is, let me correct this right now. It's the introduction to psychology. All right, here we go. So what is psychology? Psychology is the scientific study of how people think, believe, and feel, or the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. We talked a little bit about, or you read a little bit about all aspects of psychology in terms of history, where psychologists work, what kind of degrees that they have, and you need to know all that information. So some of the history of psychology: Wilhelm Wundt is considered the father of psychology. He started psychology at the University of Leipzig in Leipzig, Germany. And then William James started psychology at Harvard University in the Americas. Other key figures that you need to know about are G. Stanley Hall, who was the first individual to receive their PhD, Mary Whitton Calkins, she was the first woman to head the American Psychological Association. Margaret Floyd Washburn was the first woman who was awarded her PhD in the field of psychology. Francis C. Sumner, the first African American to earn his PhD at Clark University under G. Stanley Hall. And Kenneth and Mamie Phipps Clark, who were social psychologists, and they were at Howard University, and they were significant in the role of Brown versus Board of Education, because they had done a doll study looking at the preferences between Black and white dolls with children. So their seminal work was important to the desegregation of American schools. Then we look at Sigmund Freud, who in fact was not a psychologist. He was a psychiatrist, a medical doctor, but one of the most significant individuals in psychology because of his psychoanalytic theory. And also, we have famous people like the behavioralists, Ivan Pavlov, John B. Watson, and B.F. Skinner. And then we have the third force in psychology, which is humanistic psychology, was Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. So let's look at some of the perspectives and the modern day perspectives of psychology. The first two schools or perspectives of psychology were structuralism and functionalism. Wilhelm Wundt developed structuralism. He fashioned it out of physics, kind of atoms of the mind, and functionalism, which was influenced by the evolutionary perspective in Darwin's work, who was a distant cousin of William James. And the functionalism looks at how mental activities help an organism adapt to their environment. Then, as I mentioned before, Sigmund Freud was significant for developing the psychoanalytic theory. Today, we call it psychodynamic, but back then it was psychoanalytic. And the key element of psychoanalytic theory is looking at early childhood experiences and unconscious processes. Then we have the Gestalt psychologists, Kohler, Koffler, and Wertheimer, who were all German psychologists. And Gestalt means the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And we're going to come back to this when we get to sensation and perception. We're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail. Then we have the behavioral school or behavioralism. We have Ivan Pavlov with his salivating dogs, which we're going to talk about that in a whole chapter under learning. John B. Watson, who was considered the father of behavioralism within psychology, and B.F. Skinner, who talks about the consequences of behaviors. So those are the three names that you need to associate with behavioralism: Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner. Then we have the cognitive revolution. And the key person with the cognitive revolution is Noam Chomsky. He was very influential at the beginning of the cognitive revolution. Nowadays, he's more of a political pundit, talks a lot about climate change these days. And The cognitive revolution started in the 50s, and it focuses on language, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence. Then we have humanism, which emphasizes on the potential of ourselves and the innate goodness of all human beings. So is being all you can be without joining the army. So Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers are the significant players in this piece. And Carl Rogers talks about unconditional positive regard, congruency, and empathy with his particular emphasis on humanism. Then we have the cross-cultural perspective. This is a relatively newer perspective in psychology. And essentially the cross-cultural perspective is looking at the similarities and differences across cultures. So we often talk about individualistic versus collective cultures. And basically there's not one versus the other, but a different point of view. Individualistic culture tends to be very self-centered, micro-centered. So the family system is a mother, father, children, versus collective cultures tend to be more societal centered, and they have extended kinships. So as we talk about here in Hawaii, the extended ohana. Individualistic countries tend to be European, some European countries, North America, UK, Australia, all would be considered more individualistic cultures, even though all these countries have collective cultures within them, but the countries themselves would not be considered a collective sort of country. A very strong collective country would be China, Japan, Mexico, what would be some examples of that. And then we have the evolutionary perspective, and I'll highlight that for you. Let me highlight the evolutionary perspective for you. So the evolutionary perspective is essentially describing the changes of behavior in one's environment over time. This is taken from Charles Darwin's work and also was the basis of functionalism with William James. Then we talk about the contemporary psychology. We talk about the American Psychological Association, which is an organization that many psychologists, not all, but many psychologists belong to. There are 56 divisions of APA. There are a lot of emphasis. If we have 56 divisions, there's a lot of emphasis in psychology, and some of the emphasis are listed here: biopsychology, evolutionary psychology, cognitive, developmental, personality, social, health, sports. One of the biggest divisions in APA is clinical forensic. Forensics is dealing with the justice system and law. Sports and exercise psychology, just as it sounds, sports and physical performance. Health psychology around health and health-related biological issues. Personality, the patterns of what makes you a unique individual. Developmental, which studies the physical and mental abilities of aging and what we call maturation, which is the development over time. Cognitive is focusing on thoughts, thinking, and the biopsychology and evolutionary psychology. Biopsychology is looking at the biological processes of how we develop. So this is what chapter 3, which you're going to be covering this week, is focusing on. Then we talk about the careers in psychology. And one thing I want to point out to you is the different kinds of degrees that psychologists can have. A psychologist can have a PhD, which is a doctorate of philosophy. And many professions have the PhD, doctorate of philosophies. English, math, biochemistry, you name it, you can earn a doctorate of philosophy. Then there's a specific doctoral degree to psychology only, which is called a PsyD, and that's called the doctorate of psychology. And then we have an MD, which are medical doctors, and the medical doctors are psychiatrists. So psychiatrists and psychologists are two different professions because of the degrees. So then you'll have in chapter 2, psychological research. Now, if you did your assignment, you may be working on your assignment. If you did the first assignment, the questions in the first assignment focused on psychological research. So we talk about the scientific method. This is the process in which we observe and where we make claims about behaviors that we study as psychologists. This is how the field of psychology moves forward. Every time something needs to be investigated, it's taken through the rigor of the scientific method. Data is gathered and analyzed statistically, and it's written up in a peer-reviewed journal, and then it's replicated by another psychologist or another scientist. And if they get the same results, then they will do the same thing and write it up, and then someone else, another team or individual, may replicate the study. If they get the same results, then we can safely say that we're getting these consistent results, and therefore this is something that we need to take a look at, we need to pay attention to, because science is proving that this is happening over and over and over again in similar or in the same way, okay? Oftentimes, the scientific method starts off with a theory. And a theory is a proposed or tentative explanation behind what we may want to investigate. And the hypothesis is what we call a more concrete claim. It is often typically written in an if-then statement, and it separates specific ideas from general ideas, okay? Then when we talk about what the actual goals of psychology are, the actual goals of psychology are to describe things, to explain behavior and mental processes, to predict behavior and mental processes, and to control behavior and mental processes. And the control is not, I am a zombie and I will be mind controlled. No, it's talking about the steps we take in the scientific method, in particularly experimental design. Experimental design is a control process in the goals of psychology. So how do we approach research? We approach research through descriptive methods and experimental methods. Some descriptive methods, which just describes what we see, are naturalistic observations, case studies, surveys. All these things just give us a general explanation behind. We're just observing information, and we're reporting what we observe or what we've gathered by talking to individuals. Then we talk about what the data means when we collect this data. And we often need to analyze the findings, and we do this statistically. We do it through correlational studies or experimental design. So correlational studies, the difference between correlation and experimental, correlational studies show association between one or more variables, and experimental design shows us cause and effect. Cause and effect. A had a cause in the effect of B. And correlational studies basically move in a direction, positive or negative, or no direction, zero correlations. When we talk about a positive correlation, that means that the two variables that we're looking at move in the same direction. And then when we look at negative correlations, the two variables we're looking at move in different directions, okay? But oftentimes we do quasi-experimental design or experimental designs, and we call it quasi-experimental designs because we can't control all things in the environment, okay? But we can control a lot when we have a quasi-experimental design. So an experimental design has an experimental group and a control group. The experimental group is the group that's going to get the manipulation, the independent variable. And the control group is what is going to not be manipulated, but is going to be measured due to the manipulation, okay? So the control group must be in place so we can have a comparison to our manipulation, so we can actually say that what we manipulated, what we caused an effect, okay? So every time you have an experimental design, you have an independent variable and a dependent variable. The independent variable is what is manipulated, and the dependent variable is what is measured. And you have an experimental group, which gets all the manipulations, okay? That's where the independent variable is. And then you have the control group that gets no manipulations. It's the comparison group. So it looks exactly the same in all all elements except it's not getting the manipulation. Oftentimes we randomly assign people to these experimental groups, and we do that through a statistical method. So it's almost like spinning the wheel, and depending on where you fall on the wheel, that is what group you get placed in when you have an experimental design. We randomly assign because we want to get a representation of the whole population. And in order to randomly assign, we're taking a sample of a bigger population. And if we want to have even more control, we will develop what we call a single blind or a double blind study. And this allows us to not know who is in which group, especially if it's double blind. So the researchers are very independent from what the manipulations that are occurring in the study. So oftentimes when we talk about specific demographics, this is what we talked about, what I just said in terms of randomization. Okay. Now, how do we even get permission to do these experiments? Many psychologists, many people who are studying psychology work in universities, work in the university setting. So as a result, there is what we call an institutional review board. And this is usually a board of individuals who will examine the proposal. You have to submit a proposal, and many proposals have certain elements that need to be included, especially if you're having human or animal participants. And essentially it gets approved by this body of individuals who go over all the methodology that you will be using for your experiment. Probably one of the most famous experiments is the Tuskegee study, which I have a video that you should watch that video and review the Tuskegee study. Also, if you participate in a study that has been approved by an IRB, then you have to make sure the participants understand what they're getting into, and that's what informed consent is. One thing people don't realize is that you can't, if you start participating in a psychological experiment, you have the right to stop. And if you decide that you don't want to no longer participate at any time in the experiment, you are taken out of the experiment or the experimental situation, and the individuals who are running the experiment will debrief you about what the true nature of the experiment was and what the proposed outcomes are. One of those elements that very much demonstrates kind of poor informed consent and debriefing is the Milgram shock experiment, which we'll talk about when we get to social psychology. Okay. Now, the last thing that you're covering is chapter 3, biopsychology. And this is all about biology, all about the brain and the spinal cord. So if you've had biology or if you have physioanatomy, you're probably ahead of the game. If you've never had that, then you have quite a bit of terminology to learn. So biopsychology is the study of cells and organs that provide a more introspective look at the properties and helping us better understand psychology from a biological perspective. So this is the micro level of brain behavior. So we're talking about neurons and neurotransmitters and structures of the neuron, how the neurotransmitters and the neurons fire, how brain development happens, what structures of the brain are significant to certain behaviors that we can observe. So we have neurons, we have motor neurons, sensory neurons, and interneurons. And neurons each have sections of it. In your book, you'll see a picture of a neuron. I always make the analogy, it looks like sausage and eggs. The neurons have these tree-like branches extending from them. Those are the dendrites. It has a long tail, which is called the axon. It's covered with a membrane called the myelin sheath. At the end of the axon, there's two parts of the axon, the long tail, then we have the terminal buttons. And the terminal buttons at the end of the neuron house the neurotransmitters in kind of clear like sacs within the terminal buttons. They are activated or released when an action potential, which is a neurochemical process, runs down the axon and explodes the vesicles, synaptic vesicles in the terminal buttons. Then it crosses the synaptic gap. This is a small gap between every neuron in the body. No two neurons touch one another. They're separated by that very small synaptic gap. And as a result of that, that action that goes down, which we call action potential, there is a changing of the polarization of the membrane from positive to negative. So often think of the action potential as the movement of ions, is the action potential. Once that is signaled and reach the threshold, it will activate the synaptic vesicles to open up, and the neurotransmitters, each one of them fits like a lock and key to the next neuron to start the process all over again. The neuron where it comes from is called the presynaptic neuron, and the neuron where it goes to is called the postsynaptic neuron. So in the study guide, I put some questions that you should be able to answer. You need to look in your book and look at the tables related to these answers as well. Then we talk about the nervous system. We talk about the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord. And then we talk about the two major divisions of the central nervous system, which are the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is a network of axons, also called nerves, and the somatic nervous system is responsible for our conscious voluntary actions. And the autonomic nervous system has control over internal organs and glands, and it controls involuntary actions, okay? And then I added more study questions for you. Now, we get into the brain and the spinal cord. And the most important thing you need to remember about the brain is the brain is divided into two hemispheres that have a bundle of fibers connecting them called the corpus callosum. And you have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. You also have 4 lobes: your frontal lobe, your parietal lobe, your temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. If you put your hands on your forehead, that's your frontal lobe. That's your frontal lobe. If you make a V with your fingertips touching one another at the top and put that on the top of your head to make a V on the top of your head, an upside down V on the top of your head, that's where your parietal lobe is located. If you take your hands and put them right above your ears, that's where your temporal lobe is located. And if you cup your hands and rest your head on the back of your hands with your elbows pointing out, that's your occipital lobe. Each one of the lobes has particular functions. The frontal lobe is the most important because it helps you plan, reason, execute your emotional and motor control. The motor cortex is located in the frontal lobe. Your parietal lobe is for touch, temperature, pain, sensations. And that's where your somatosensory cortex is located. Your temporal lobe is the auditory cortex. So this is for hearing, where hearing and memory and hearing emotions are connected to. And then the occipital lobe, your eyeball, your eye sockets, your eyes are the organ that processes the information, but the occipital lobe takes care of the perception of what you see. So it's called the visual cortex. Oftentimes the brain is divided into 3 different parts: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. The forebrain covers the outer hemisphere, which consists of the thalamus and the limbic system. The thalamus is the relay station of the brain. Every sensation, with the exception of your sense of smell, goes through the thalamus before it goes to the associative area of the brain, to the proper lobe of the brain. The midbrain, it has a reticular formation, the substantia nigra, the ventral tegmental areas. And the hindbrain has the medulla pons and the cerebellum. This is often considered the oldest part of the brain. If you've ever heard of someone being brain dead, they're often referring to the brain stem, which extends out of the hindbrain into the spinal cord. And if that has any severe damage, it controls the hindbrain structures often have involuntary processes. So your heart beating, your lungs inhaling and exhaling, swallowing, coughing. We can do those automatically. So if that part of the brain can't tell you to do those things, then this is when we refer to someone being brain dead. Now, there was a very interesting individual called Phineas Gage who had a tempering rod from a railroad accident shoot up through his eye socket through the front part of his brain. I have a video about Phineas Gage that you should watch. And because of Phineas Gage, we know a lot about brain development and particularly the frontal lobe and what can happen if you have brain damage in that area. And later on in the 40s and 50s, treating people with mental health conditions, they used to do prefrontal lobotomies. If you ever saw the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that is one of the things that happened in that movie. And essentially, they would take a metal rod through the nasal cavity and all the way up to the frontal lobe of the brain, wiggle it around and pull it back out through the nasal cavity. As a result, the individuals may have a change in their behavior. Sometimes the change in the behavior made things worse, and sometimes it made the person docile. But that happened because they were destroying that very important aspects of the frontal lobe. Remember, reasoning, language acquisition, emotions, and motor control. Then we talk about aphasias. Aphasias are the inability to produce language and understand language because of some brain damage. We have two areas, Broca's areas and Wernicke's areas. Both are aphasias. I also have a video about aphasias that you should take a look at. When we talk about Broca's area, it's in the left lower frontal lobe, and Wernicke's area is in the left hemisphere. So both of them on the left side of the brain because language is on the left side of the brain. So if a person has a stroke and they have difficulty talking, that means that they had a brain bleed, because that's what stroke blood vessels break in the brain, and blood contaminates structures of the brain and causes it damage and death to those areas of the brain. And then the individual might not be able to speak. Now, also referring to stroke, individuals who had strokes, we talk about lateralization. Everything on the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, and everything on the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. So if a person has a stroke and they have paralysis on the right side of their body, that means that the stroke area is somewhere concentrated on the left side of the brain. Now, you can have strokes on both sides of the hemispheres of the brain, and that would be demonstrated by what we observe in terms of the person not being able to speak, or they not being able to move certain parts of their body. Then the last systems we're going to talk about is the endocrine system. This is the glands, your hypothalamus, which is a structure in the brain that connects the endocrine system to the rest of the brain. The endocrine system has a pituitary gland, the pineal gland, it has the adrenals, it has the pancreas, it has the gonads, which are the testes and the ovaries. All of this makes up the endocrine system. So it's very much regulated by hormones. This is also what the hypothalamus does. It helps regulate hormones. Another structure I'm going to mention too, that's in the mid part of the brain, is the amygdala. The amygdala is the part of the brain that helps us understand fear and emotions as well. So make sure you look at all my videos that I've posted for you, because the videos explain concepts further than the textbook. And if you're not fond of reading, the videos will help you greatly understand the materials that are presented in the written form and in the PowerPoint slides or the Google slides or the PDF slides. If you have any questions, be sure to stop by virtual office hours or email me directly. This is Dr. Lucas signing off. Have a bright and wonderful day.